"I don't care if your daughter is dying," screamed the HOA Karen as my premature baby cried in terror. She had no idea I was a senior police detective. She had no idea that threatening my miracle child, who'd already survived 127 days fighting for life in NICU, was the biggest mistake of her pathetic existence. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife. I looked up from securing my 8-month-old daughter Emma in her specialized car seat to see a woman in her 50s marching toward me with the fury of someone who had just witnessed a crime. Margaret Thornfield, or as the neighbors secretly called her, HOA Karen, stood in my driveway at 7:30 a.m., clipboard clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her face twisted with righteous indignation. "Ma'am, I'm just putting my daughter in her car seat," I replied calmly, continuing to adjust Emma's medical monitoring equipment. My little girl had been born 3 months premature and spent the first 4 months of her life fighting for survival in the NICU. Every breath was a victory, every smile a miracle. "Don't you ma'am me?" Margaret snapped, stepping closer. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, HOA compliance officer, and you are in serious violation of community standards." I paused, looking at this woman who was screaming at me while I tended to my medically fragile daughter. Emma began to fuss, sensing the tension in the air. "What violations?" I asked, my voice carrying the controlled tone I'd learned in 23 years of police work. "Your car is parked improperly. You have unauthorized equipment cluttering your vehicle. And that ridiculous contraption you're putting that child in is excessive and unsightly." I stared at her in disbelief. The ridiculous contraption was Emma's $2,000 medical-grade car seat, prescribed by her pediatrician and equipped with breathing monitors and specialized positioning straps. The unauthorized equipment was the medical device that kept my premature daughter alive during car rides. "Ma'am, this is medical equipment," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "My daughter was born premature and requires—" "I don't care what sob story you've cooked up," Margaret interrupted, her voice growing even louder. "Rules are rules. This is a respectable community, not some charity case dumping ground." Emma started crying, overwhelmed by the shouting. I instinctively moved to shield her with my body, my protective instincts flaring. "Please lower your voice," I said firmly. "You're upsetting my baby." Margaret's eyes blazed with malicious satisfaction. "Good. Maybe she'll learn that actions have consequences. You people move into our neighborhood and think you can do whatever you want." "You people?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes. You people with your sob stories and your special needs and your excuses." Margaret spat. "I don't care if your daughter is dying, community standards come first." The words hit me like a physical blow. This woman had just told me she didn't care if my daughter, my miracle baby who had fought death and won, was dying. At just 8 months old, Emma had already been through more than any child should ever face. Born at 28 weeks gestation, weighing only 2 pounds 4 ounces, she had spent 127 days in the NICU. Every day my wife Sarah and I had watched our tiny daughter fight for each breath, celebrated every ounce of weight gained, every day without setbacks. And now this woman was telling me she didn't care if Emma died. "I see," I said quietly, my voice carrying a dangerous calm that made Margaret pause for just a moment. "Thank you for making your position perfectly clear." But Margaret wasn't done. She had no idea that she was picking a fight with someone who had dedicated his career to protecting children, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and knew exactly how to deal with bullies who targeted the vulnerable. She had no idea that her reign of terror was about to come to a very sudden, very permanent end. "Now fix these violations immediately or I'm calling the police," Margaret declared triumphantly. I looked down at Emma, who was still crying from the trauma of being screamed at by a stranger, then back at Margaret's satisfied smirk. "Actually," I said quietly, "I think that's an excellent idea." After feeding and changing her, I carefully secured Emma in her specialized car seat. Due to her premature birth and ongoing respiratory issues, Emma required a specific medical-grade car seat with extra safety straps and monitoring equipment. The pediatrician had been very clear, this wasn't just any car seat. It was literally keeping my daughter safe and monitoring her breathing patterns during travel. The car seat had cost us nearly $2,000, but after everything Emma had been through, no expense was too great for her safety. The intricate strap system was designed specifically for premature babies with delicate respiratory systems. Each strap served a crucial purpose in maintaining proper positioning to keep her airways clear. I loaded Emma into our modest Honda Civic, parked in our designated spot at Willowbrook Gardens HOA community. We had moved here 6 months ago, thinking it would be a safe, family-friendly neighborhood to raise Emma. The HOA rules seemed reasonable enough, and the community appeared welcoming. How wrong I was. As I drove to Emma's pediatric appointment, I noticed a woman in her 50s standing near the community mailboxes, arms crossed, glaring at passing cars with the intensity of a hawk hunting prey. Margaret Thornfield, or as residents secretly called her, HOA Karen. She had appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of every community rule, no matter how trivial. Margaret had made it her personal mission to find violations where none existed. She measured grass heights with a ruler, counted the exact number of holiday decorations, and documented every perceived infraction with the dedication of a forensic investigator. The pediatric appointment went well. Dr. Martinez was pleased with Emma's progress, though she reminded me about the critical importance of the specialized car seat. Emma's respiratory system is still developing, she explained. Any compromise to that car seat's integrity could be life-threatening. Those straps aren't just for safety, they're medical equipment. I nodded, holding Emma close. Every parent worries about their child's safety, but when your baby has fought death and won, that protective instinct becomes overwhelming. When we returned home around noon, I noticed Margaret standing suspiciously close to my car, clipboard in hand, pen poised like a weapon. I parked and began the careful process of removing Emma from her car seat, ensuring all her monitoring equipment remained properly connected. "Excuse me." Margaret's shrill voice cut through the peaceful afternoon air. I looked up, Emma cradled in my arms. "Yes, ma'am?" "I'm Margaret Thornfield, HOA Compliance Officer," she announced with the authority of someone who believed a clipboard granted governmental power. "I need to discuss several violations with you." "Violations?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What violations?" Margaret consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "First, your car is parked 3 inches over the designated line. Second, you have unauthorized equipment visible in your vehicle. Third, your visitor parking pass from last weekend is still on your dashboard, which violates the 48-hour removal rule." I glanced at my car. It was parked normally, well within the lines. The unauthorized equipment was Emma's medical monitoring device, and the visitor pass was for my mother-in-law, who had helped us during Emma's recent respiratory infection. "Ma'am, I think there might be some misunderstanding," I said calmly, my police training helping me maintain composure. "My car is parked properly, the equipment is medical equipment for my daughter, and—" "Don't you dare argue with me." Margaret's face flushed red. "I've been managing this community for 12 years. I know violations when I see them." Emma began to fuss in my arms, sensing the tension. I gently bounced her, trying to keep her calm. "I understand your dedication to the community, but perhaps we could discuss this later? My daughter has medical needs that—" "Your daughter is not my concern," Margaret snapped. "Community standards are. You new residents think you can just ignore our rules." The cruel dismissal of Emma's well-being hit me like a physical blow. This woman was looking at my miracle baby, my fighter who had survived against impossible odds, and calling her irrelevant. "I need to get my daughter inside," I said firmly, my voice carrying the authoritative tone I used during police work. "We can discuss this later." "Oh no, we're discussing this now." Margaret stepped closer, her voice rising. "You people move in here and think you can do whatever you want. Well, not on my watch." Emma started crying, overwhelmed by the shouting. I tried to shield her with my body while reaching for my keys. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're upsetting my baby. Your baby needs to learn that rules matter." Margaret screamed. That's when something inside me snapped. Not anger, but a cold, protective fury that every parent feels when someone threatens their child. My voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you once more to step back and lower your voice." Margaret seemed to interpret my controlled response as weakness. "Or what? You'll call the police? Good luck with that, rookie. I have connections in this town that you can't imagine." If only she knew. I managed to get Emma inside, but Margaret wasn't finished. Over the next hour, she pounded on my door repeatedly, shouting about violations and demanding immediate compliance. Each knock sent Emma into hysterics, disrupting her crucial rest time. Finally, exhaustion overtook my daughter, and she fell into a fitful sleep. I stepped outside to address Margaret once and for all. "Look, Mrs. Thornfield," I began, "I understand you take the HOA rules seriously, but my daughter has serious medical conditions. The equipment in my car isn't decorative, it's keeping her alive. The parking situation can be easily resolved, and I don't care if your daughter is dying." Margaret screamed, her face contorted with rage. Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, move somewhere else. The words hung in the air like poison. I stared at this woman who had just told me she didn't care if my baby died, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I see, I said quietly. Thank you for making your position clear. Margaret seemed satisfied with what she perceived as my capitulation. Good. Now you have 24 hours to correct these violations, or I'm filing complaints with the HOA board and the city. She stormed off, leaving me standing in my driveway, shaking with barely controlled fury. That evening, Sarah came home to find me holding Emma, both of us exhausted from the day's drama. How did the appointment go? She asked, kissing Emma's forehead. I told her everything. Sarah's face went through a spectrum of emotions: concern, disbelief, and finally cold anger. She said she didn't care if Emma died? Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. Those were her exact words. Sarah looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in my arms. Our miracle baby, who had fought so hard to be here, reduced to an inconvenience by a woman drunk on petty power. What are we going to do? Sarah asked. Nothing, I said. Yet. The next morning brought a new level of Margaret's harassment. She was waiting by my car at 7 a.m., camera in hand, documenting every angle of my violations. Emma was having a difficult morning, her breathing slightly labored, requiring extra attention with her medical equipment. As I carefully placed Emma in her specialized car seat, adjusting each strap with the precision Dr. Martinez had taught me, Margaret appeared beside my car. Still haven't fixed these violations, I see, she announced loudly. Mrs. Thornfield, please, I said, focusing on Emma's safety straps. I'm dealing with medical equipment here. That's not medical equipment, that's junk, Margaret declared. And these straps are excessive. No baby needs this many straps. You're probably using this as an excuse to violate parking regulations. I froze. She was criticizing Emma's life-saving equipment that monitored her breathing and kept her positioned correctly to prevent respiratory distress. Ma'am, this car seat is prescribed by her pediatrician. My daughter was born premature and... Excuses? Margaret waved her hand dismissively. I raised 4 children without all this unnecessary nonsense. I finished securing Emma and stood up, my full 6'2" frame towering over Margaret. Years of police work had given me an imposing presence when needed. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to say this once more. My daughter's medical equipment is not up for debate. Her safety is not up for discussion. I suggest you find something more productive to do with your time. Margaret's eyes narrowed with malicious intent. Oh, I'll find something productive, all right. We'll see how tough you are when the HOA board hears about your attitude. I drove to work that day with a heavy heart. Emma fell asleep during the drive, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily, the car seat's monitoring system showing all green lights. She was so small, so vulnerable, yet so strong. How could anyone look at her and feel anything but protective love? At the police station, I tried to focus on my duties, but my mind kept returning to Margaret's cruel words. My partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, noticed my distraction. You okay, Tom? You seem off today. I told Mike about the situation. His expression grew darker with each detail. She said, what about Emma? Mike had met Emma several times and adored her. Tom, that woman is unhinged. You want me to have a chat with her? No, I said. This needs to be handled properly. If I'm going to use my position, it has to be by the book. Mike nodded, understanding. Just remember, brother, sometimes the book includes protecting your family from harassment. That afternoon brought a new nightmare. I arrived home to find Margaret in my driveway holding a pair of scissors, standing next to my open car. What are you doing? I shouted, running toward her. Margaret spun around, scissors raised. Teaching you a lesson about excessive equipment. My blood turned to ice as I saw what she had done. Margaret had cut through several of Emma's car seat safety straps, the very straps that kept my premature daughter properly positioned and breathing safely. You destroyed my daughter's medical equipment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've solved your parking problem, Margaret declared triumphantly. Without all this unnecessary junk in your car, you'll park better. I stared at the severed straps, each cut representing a potential threat to Emma's life. The specialized car seat that had taken months to get approved by insurance, that had been specifically calibrated for Emma's medical needs, was now compromised. You could have killed my daughter, I whispered, the reality hitting me like a truck. Oh, please? Margaret rolled her eyes. It's just a few straps. Stop being so dramatic. That's when 23 years of police training took over. Not the aggressive, confrontational side, but the methodical, evidence-gathering, case-building side. Mrs. Thornfield, I said, my voice completely calm, I need you to stay right where you are. Something in my tone made Margaret pause. For the first time she seemed to recognize that she might have crossed a line. I pulled out my phone and began recording. Can you please state your name and explain what you just did to my car? I was enforcing HOA regulations, Margaret stammered, suddenly less confident. By cutting safety equipment in a child's medical car seat? It's not medical equipment. It's just excessive straps. I moved closer, the camera capturing the destroyed car seat. Mrs. Thornfield, this is a specialized medical car seat prescribed by a pediatrician for a premature infant with respiratory issues. You have just destroyed medical equipment necessary for my daughter's safety. Margaret's face went pale as the reality of her actions began to sink in. Furthermore, I continued, you have just admitted on camera to deliberately destroying property, which constitutes vandalism. You have also endangered the life of a child by compromising safety equipment designed to prevent respiratory distress. I didn't know. Margaret began to back away. You were told repeatedly that this was medical equipment, I said, my voice gaining the authority of someone used to taking control of situations. You chose to ignore those warnings and proceed with destructive action that could have resulted in the death of an 8-month-old child. Margaret tried to run, but I wasn't finished. Mrs. Thornfield, I am Detective Tom Harrison with the Metro Police Department. You are under arrest for vandalism, destruction of medical equipment, and child endangerment. The color drained completely from Margaret's face. You're a cop? Senior detective, actually. 12 years on the force, specializing in cases involving crimes against children. I pulled out my badge and handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. As I read Margaret her rights, I could see the exact moment she realized the magnitude of her mistake. This wasn't just some new resident she could bully. This was a senior police officer whose premature daughter she had just endangered. Please, Margaret whimpered as I cuffed her. I didn't know she was really sick. I thought you were lying about the medical stuff. You thought I was lying about my daughter's medical needs? The controlled fury in my voice made Margaret flinch. You thought I was lying about equipment prescribed by her pediatrician? You thought I was lying about a premature baby who spent 4 months in intensive care fighting for her life. Margaret began to cry, finally understanding the full weight of her actions. Neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Many of them had dealt with Margaret's harassment but had never seen her face consequences. Mrs. Chin from next door approached hesitantly. Officer. Detective Harrison? Is everything all right? Mrs. Chin, I'm afraid Mrs. Thornfield here decided to destroy my daughter's medical car seat. She cut the safety straps that keep Emma positioned properly for breathing. Mrs. Chin gasped, covering her mouth. She cut Emma's car seat? That sweet baby? Word spread quickly through the gathered crowd. Emma was beloved in the neighborhood. Her survival story had touched everyone who heard it. To learn that Margaret had deliberately endangered her was beyond comprehension. She could have killed that baby. Mr. Johnson from across the street exclaimed. All over parking nonsense, added Mrs. Williams. Margaret looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her, finally realizing that her reign of HOA terror had come to an end. The patrol car arrived within minutes. The responding officers were colleagues who knew me well. Officer Janet Walsh took one look at the situation and shook her head in disgust. What happened, Tom? I explained the situation while maintaining my professional demeanor, but Janet could see the barely controlled emotion beneath the surface. She cut a preemie's medical car seat? Janet's voice was incredulous. What kind of monster does that? As Margaret was loaded into the patrol car, she made one last desperate attempt at manipulation. This is harassment, she shouted. I'm being persecuted for doing my job as HOA compliance officer. I walked over to the patrol car window. Mrs. Thornfield, your job, as HOA compliance officer does not include destroying medical equipment. It does not include endangering children. And it certainly does not include telling a parent you don't care if their baby dies. Margaret's face crumpled. I didn't mean that. Yes, you did, I said quietly. You meant every word. And now you get to explain to a judge why you thought it was acceptable to endanger an 8-month-old child who has already fought so hard just to be alive. As the patrol car drove away, the gathered neighbors began to disperse, many of them stopping to express their support and horror at what had happened. Mrs. Chen lingered, tears in her eyes. How is Emma? Is she okay? She's napping inside, thank God. She doesn't know how close she came to. I couldn't finish the sentence. What happens now? She asked. Now Margaret faces the consequences of her actions. And I have to figure out how to replace Emma's car seat before her next medical appointment. Sarah arrived home to find me sitting in the driveway staring at the destroyed car seat. She took one look at the cut straps and immediately understood. Oh my God, Tom. She actually cut Emma's car seat. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. She could have killed her, Sarah. If we had been in an accident, if Emma had had breathing problems, if any number of things had gone wrong. Sarah sat down beside me, both of us staring at the evidence of Margaret's malicious actions. Is she in jail? For now. She'll be charged with multiple crimes. The district attorney is taking this very seriously. Crimes against children, especially those involving medical equipment, carry severe penalties. Good, Sarah said fiercely. She needs to face consequences. That evening, as I held Emma during her bedtime routine, I thought about how close we had come to tragedy. Not from Emma's medical conditions, which we had learned to manage, but from the deliberate malice of someone who had decided our child's life was less important than parking regulations. Emma looked up at me with her bright blue eyes, completely unaware of the danger she had been in. She gurgled happily, her tiny hand grasping my finger with that surprising strength that had helped her survive her earliest days. You're safe, princess, I whispered. Daddy made sure of that. The next few days brought a parade of neighbors expressing their support and sharing their own stories of Margaret's harassment. It became clear that her behavior toward us was part of a much larger pattern of abuse. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, an elderly couple on the next street, revealed that Margaret had threatened to have their granddaughter's wheelchair-accessible van towed because it was too large for community standards. The Gonzalez family shared how Margaret had called Child Protective Services on them, claiming their children were unsupervised when they played in their own fenced backyard. Single mother Lisa Monroe broke down crying as she described how Margaret had tried to have her evicted for having too many visitors. The visitors were Lisa's sister and mother, who helped with childcare while Lisa worked 2 jobs. Story after story emerged of Margaret's systematic harassment of anyone she perceived as vulnerable or different. Families with children, elderly residents, single parents, people with disabilities, all had been targeted by her particular brand of cruel enforcement. The HOA board, faced with mounting evidence of Margaret's abusive behavior and the criminal charges she now faced, held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to remove her from all positions and implement new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Margaret's court date arrived 3 weeks later. As a senior detective, I had testified in countless court proceedings, but this felt different. This was personal. The courtroom was packed with neighbors who had been victimized by Margaret's harassment. Many brought photos of their children, their elderly parents, their family members with disabilities, all the people Margaret had dismissed as unworthy of basic human decency. When Margaret's attorney tried to portray her actions as overzealous community service, the prosecutor presented a devastating case. Your Honor, District Attorney Rebecca Martinez began, the defendant didn't just vandalize property. She didn't just harass neighbors. She deliberately destroyed medical equipment designed to keep a premature infant alive. The prosecutor displayed photos of Emma's destroyed car seat, explaining in detail how each cut strap compromised vital safety features. The defendant was told repeatedly that this was medical equipment. She was informed that the child in question was born 3 months premature and required specialized safety measures. Her response was to tell the father, and I quote, "I don't care if your daughter is dying." A collective gasp rose from the courtroom. When Detective Harrison attempted to de-escalate the situation, the defendant escalated her harassment. When he tried to protect his daughter from her verbal abuse, she retaliated by destroying equipment specifically designed to prevent respiratory distress in a medically fragile child. Margaret's attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable as the full scope of his client's actions became clear. Furthermore, Your Honor, this was not an isolated incident. We have documented evidence of the defendant's systematic harassment of vulnerable residents, including elderly individuals, single parents, and families with disabled children. When it came time for victim impact statements, I stood to address the court. Your Honor, my daughter Emma was born at 28 weeks gestation. She weighed 2 pounds 4 ounces. She spent the first 4 months of her life fighting for survival in the neonatal intensive care unit. I pulled out my phone and showed a photo of Emma in the NICU, surrounded by life support equipment. Every day for 4 months my wife and I watched our daughter fight for each breath. We celebrated every ounce of weight gain, every day without setbacks, every small milestone that brought her closer to coming home. The courtroom was completely silent. When Emma was finally released from the hospital, she came home with specialized medical equipment designed to keep her safe. The car seat that Mrs. Thornfield destroyed wasn't just a car seat, it was medical equipment prescribed by her pediatrician to prevent respiratory distress during travel. I looked directly at Margaret, who was staring at her hands. Mrs. Thornfield looked at my daughter, a child who had already fought death and won, and decided that HOA parking regulations were more important than her life. She told me she didn't care if Emma died. Then she proved it by destroying the equipment designed to keep her alive. My voice began to break slightly. Your Honor, I've been a police officer for 23 years. I've seen the worst of human nature. But I have never encountered someone who would deliberately endanger a child out of petty spite. I sat down, emotionally drained but satisfied that the court understood the full impact of Margaret's actions. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, looked at Margaret with undisguised disgust. Mrs. Thornfield, in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such callous disregard for human life. Your actions endangered a medically fragile infant for reasons that can only be described as petty and vindictive. Margaret's attorney attempted one last plea for leniency, but Judge Williams cut him off. Counselor, your client told a parent she didn't care if his child died, then proceeded to destroy medical equipment designed to prevent exactly that outcome. There is no mitigating circumstance that excuses such behavior. The sentence was swift and severe: 2 years in prison for child endangerment, 6 months for vandalism, substantial fines, and a permanent restraining order preventing Margaret from contacting our family or entering our neighborhood. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, she turned back toward the courtroom with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she mouthed, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done. But it was too late for apologies. Outside the courthouse, neighbors who had attended the hearing gathered around Sarah and me. Justice was served today, Mrs. Chin said, tears in her eyes. That woman terrorized so many families. Emma is lucky to have such strong parents, added Mr. Johnson. As we drove home, Sarah and I felt a sense of closure. Margaret would face consequences for her actions, and our neighborhood would be safer for all children. That evening, as I held Emma during her bedtime routine, I reflected on everything that had happened. Our daughter had survived premature birth, months in intensive care, and a malicious attack on her safety equipment. Through it all, she had remained our happy, strong little fighter. You know what, princess? I whispered as Emma drifted off to sleep. Sometimes the good guys really do win. Emma smiled in her sleep, safe in her father's arms, surrounded by love and protected by justice. 6 months later, our neighborhood had transformed. With Margaret gone, families felt safe to let their children play outside. Elderly residents no longer feared harassment for minor violations. The HOA board had implemented reasonable policies focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. Emma continued to thrive, eventually outgrowing her specialized car seat as her respiratory system strengthened. But we kept that destroyed car seat in our garage as a reminder of how precious life is and how important it is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about arresting Margaret, if I think the punishment was too harsh. My answer is always the same. I think about Emma in that NICU fighting for every breath, and I remember Margaret saying she didn't care if my daughter died. No parent should ever have to hear those words about their child. No child should ever be endangered by an adult's petty cruelty. Margaret made her choice when she decided that parking regulations were more important than a baby's life. I made mine when I decided that protecting my daughter was more important than keeping the peace. Today, Emma is a happy, healthy toddler who loves to play in our safe, peaceful neighborhood. She has no memory of those dark early days in the hospital or the woman who tried to hurt her. And that's exactly how it should be. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protection. It's about ensuring that innocent children can grow up safe from those who would harm them for their own twisted satisfaction. As I watch Emma play in our yard, laughing and running with the other neighborhood children, I know that everything we went through was worth it. She's alive, she's safe, and she's surrounded by a community that truly cares about protecting its most vulnerable members. That's the kind of neighborhood every child deserves to grow up in. And that's the kind of justice every parent should be able to count on.